Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markel, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. This is episode 136. In today's episode, I have the privilege of introducing you to Leslie McFadden, a courageous survivor sharing her deeply personal journey of being drugged and raped. I met Leslie through a previous SASS guest, Rachel Izzo, who shares a similar experience with Leslie. If you haven't heard Rachel's episodes, please take time to listen to those also. Leslie's experience is another example of a systemic problem. She reported her rape to the New York Police Department Special Victims Unit, where she faced an additional level of trauma. This is part one of a two-part encounter. Here's Leslie. Leslie McFadden, thank you for joining me on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Just so my audience knows, Leslie and I met through Instagram, but I knew about Leslie because of Rachel Izzo. And if any of you have heard Rachel Izzo's episodes, she's mentioned Leslie a couple of times. Leslie and I finally made connection through Instagram. She's agreed to be here today and talk to us about her experiences because she had some very similar experiences with the New York Police Department and some frustrations with the whole investigation. And so we're going to talk about that, but we're also going to hear more about Leslie's personal experiences and how she's been able to cope with what she's been through and what she's doing today in helping other victims and survivors through their healing path. Tell us about yourself. Give us some background if you don't mind.
Sure. I am originally from Florida, really small town called Lake City. That's where I grew up. I was living in New York at the time I was assaulted. I was working as a content designer. The next question everybody asks me is, what is a content designer? I write the UX copy that you see, for example, in an app. So I'm the person that writes that copy in the app or a website. So I've been doing that for the past 10 years. At the time, I was working in New York as a content designer when I was drugged and raped by a colleague. That dramatically changed my life. And I went through a whole saga with the New York City Police Department and trying to get justice for myself. Along the way, I met other survivors and learned that there were systemic problems within the Special Victims Division. And ultimately, I met Rachel and some other folks. Together, we spoke with Department of Justice investigators and collectively got a federal investigation opened into the NYPD Special Victims Division. By that point, I had moved away. The trauma that I'd gone through in New York was a lot. And I ended up moving away to California and kind of started my healing process over after I moved. And so when that announcement was made, it was just such a pleasant surprise, honestly, to finally get some form of justice. For some people, that was the only form of justice that they saw. So that was really powerful. Around the same time, I started volunteering for an organization called RISE. That's Amanda Wynn's civil rights organization. And I've been working on passing legislation in several states. This is survivor focused legislation, passing rights for survivors. I passed a law in California, and now I'm working on other states with other survivors and allies who volunteer for the organization.
Yeah.
So that's been a great outlet for me to try to help other survivors and protect future survivors from having the same experience that I did with law enforcement and trying to help out and do something positive. I'm still hoping that I can do more to help other survivors. It's part of my healing journey.
Right.
Makes me feel good. And then the latest news is that I'm working on a memoir about my experience, just trying to put that all together and get that out.
Excellent. I'm really happy to hear that. I would love for you to let us know when that comes out. Maybe we can do another episode together
I would love that.
Get some publicity going out there.
Yeah.
I'd love that.
Yeah.
Can I go back to something you mentioned? You said a federal investigation had been launched into the NYPD systemic issues.
Yes. So that was the Department of Justice investigation into the NYPD. We had interviewed with them the year before it was announced. So they did a preliminary investigation. So we didn't really hear anything for quite a while. And we're kind of left wondering, is this really going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Are we being listened to? Are we being taken seriously? It seemed like they took us seriously, but you always have that concern that maybe it's not going to work out. So I was very happy when it was finally announced in 2022 that a full investigation had been opened into the SVD.
Right. And Rachel made mention of that on her episode, but she also made mention that under the Trump administration, there's a risk and an issue about whether or not that investigation is going to be allowed to continue. Have you heard anything one way or another about that?
As far as I know, the investigation is still open, but I do know that they are looking into all the open civil rights investigations to figure out which ones are going to be continued and which ones are not. So there is a major concern based on past statements by the Trump administration that they're interested in rolling back some of the investigations into police abuse.
Yeah.
And so there's a very strong concern that they're going to end this investigation.
Leslie, I'm really, truly, from the depths of my heart, sorry for the experience that you had that even brings us to this podcast episode. Are you able to tell us more about that experience?
Yes, I've gotten used to talking about it, and at this point, I'm pretty comfortable with it. I've never told the whole story quite like this, so bear with me as I try to get it out. So, this happened back in 2015. At the time, I was working in Manhattan in the financial district. And at that time, it was pretty normal for groups of people to go out for happy hour on Stone Street. So, Stone Street is a bar lined street that was like a few blocks from my office. And people would go out there regularly to have happy hour, early dinner, things like that. So, at that time, there when people would come to the office from other states, because we had offices in multiple states. So if someone came in from out of town, sometimes we would all go out and just, have a friendly, happy hour. And so this was not my first time being out with this person. It was not unusual, but that particular day, he was in town. He came up to my desk and asked if I wanted to go out for happy hour. I wish I could say I thought about it or something, but I didn't. I just said, "Yeah, sure," because this was something that was usual, typical for me.
Right.
And so I said, "Sure." And then I proceeded to ask him about various people, to see if they were interested in going. But by that point, almost everybody had left for the day. And so finally, I asked about someone on his team that worked for him. I'll call him Steven. That's not his real name. I asked if Steven was going, and he said, "I'll check." So he left my desk, walked over, came back, and said he'll join us at the bar. So I said, "Okay." He asked if he could store his bag in my desk, which I didn't think was unusual. I just figured he didn't want to carry it around. And so I put it in my desk, and I went to lock it because I'm used to locking my things in my desk. But then he said, "What if he gets to the office before me the next day?" And so I left it open. I later wished that I had left it locked, so he could have been seen showing up to work the next day trying to unlock it when I didn't show up the next day. So we walked to Stone Street together, and I remember that he told me he was staying at a hotel in Brooklyn, and I thought that was a little weird because there are hotels close to where the office was. And I asked him, "Why are you not staying around here?" And he said, "Oh, I'm just trying to save the company some money." I didn't question it, but I thought that was a little weird. Like, why does he care? Later, I thought to myself, maybe he didn't want any witnesses from the office. And so we went to the first bar. I texted my other colleague, Steven, and told him where we were. And we sat there, we ordered drinks. I got a glass of wine. And after the waitress came by to take our order and she left, he made this comment to me. He said, "She's a cutie." It caught me off guard because I had never heard him speak like that about women. I really didn't know what to say. It made me uncomfortable, but I think I just laughed it off, because I didn't know what to do. But that comment stuck out to me. Why is he talking that way? And then after that, we just made small talk until my other colleague, Steven, showed up. My colleague got a drink, and then we were all just chatting. And then after a while, this guy wanted to bar hop. He wanted to go to a different bar to check it out. And so we agreed that we would pay each take turns paying for a round. One thing I did forget to mention, I had texted my husband to tell him, hey, I'm out with so and so and so and so. Is that okay? And he said, yeah, go for it. So we were in communication when all this was going on. I was texting with him, and he paid for the first round. And then we went to a second bar still on Stone Street. And once again, I had a glass of wine and we were just talking. One thing I want to mention is that I had stood up, walked away from the table to call my husband. We had a conversation about something unrelated. And I went back to the table. So I did leave my drink unattended. And at another point, I did it again because I had to go to the bathroom. And when I came back, that was another instance where I left the table. But everything was fine. I felt fine, nothing unusual. Stephen paid for that round. And then this guy suggests we go to a third bar. This is when things start to get a little weird. I could not clearly remember the name of the third bar. I couldn't clearly remember going there, but I know we went to a third bar. And same thing, we sat at a table. I ordered a glass of wine. But this time, while we were talking, I accidentally, while I was speaking, knocked over my glass of wine. It went all over me. They were sort of laughing at me because I made a huge mess. And the waitress came by and dropped off some napkins. I took the napkins and I started trying to mop up the mess of wine. And as I did that, I noticed that I had to concentrate on moving my hand. But I don't do drugs, so I didn't have this sense of, wait a minute, something is really wrong. I just thought maybe the wine was getting to me. I wasn't really alarmed. At one point, my husband texted me and he asked me if I was going to eat dinner while I was out. And I tried to answer him, and it was just coming out like gibberish. I kept trying to type, it was nonsense. So I ended up not sending the text because I couldn't get it to come out the way I wanted it to. So I just had this gibberish text sitting on my phone unsent. But the first word was no. When he asked me, "Are you eating dinner out?" and I said, "No," but I never sent the text. But that's one piece of proof to myself that I had no intention of being out beyond that.
Right.
So at one point, I again had to get up and go to the bathroom. I noticed that afterward, when I was going back to where we were sitting, I had to concentrate on going up the stairs. Like when I say concentrate, I mean like I shouldn't have phrased it like that. That's an understatement. I was clinging to the walls trying to go up these stairs, and but I still wasn't alarmed because if anything, I felt euphoric. I felt really good. I felt great. And so I wasn't alarmed. And when I tried to go back to where we were sitting, I got very disoriented. I circled the bar area. I got kind of confused. I couldn't figure out where we were. I came back and I noticed that Steven was gone. I don't remember him leaving. He later told me that I was there when he left, but I don't remember that at all. He was just not there. The last thing that I remember this guy the last thing that I remember him saying to me was, "What's going on between you and your husband?" You know how when you're in a dream and it's really hard to talk, it's really hard to move your mouth? That's what it was like. I don't even know if I did say anything. It was like that feeling of like I can't speak. I have no idea if I fell over. I don't know if I answered him. No idea. Everything just went black. The next thing I know, I sit up and I'm in a hospital. There are machines beeping all around me, and I'm just in this hospital bed, and I'm right by the nurse's station. I look over and I'm like in a daze. It was a very strange feeling. And I look over at the nurse's station. I just say, "What time is it?" I don't know why that was the first thing I asked, but I asked what time it was. And she said, I don't even remember what the exact time was, but it was like five something. And I thought, five something? The next day, it's the next day. I couldn't understand what was happening. I didn't have my phone, I didn't have my purse, and that's when I realized I'm wearing a hospital gown, my clothes are gone. I asked to use, if they had like a courtesy phone, and she said it was in the hallway. So I walk over to the hallway phone and I dial my husband's number. When he answers the phone, he just starts crying. He just is falling apart. He said that he thought I died, that he had been trying to he called me repeatedly, he texted me repeatedly trying to figure out what was going on and what happened. At one point, he and I thought this was very smart of him, he went into the iCloud to try to get my coworkers' contact information to see if they knew what happened to me. So he had just been frantically calling people trying to figure out what happened. And at one point, he had also did the find my iPhone feature, and so was trying to track what happened. And at one point, my phone was pinging from a hotel in Brooklyn, and he said, was that so and so's hotel? I just instantly felt sick. I knew as soon as he said it, that's where I went, and I knew it was his hotel. It had to be. He was the last person I remembered being with, but I didn't remember what happened. I told him I don't remember going to a hotel. I don't remember agreeing going to a hotel. I don't know what happened. And he kept asking me like what happened between us. And I said, I don't know. I don't know. It's blank. And so he said that he was going to come to the hospital after he dropped our son off at daycare. At that time, my son was almost 2 years old. So that was the reason why he didn't go to the hospital in the middle of the night, because he had no one to give our son to. He had to take care of him first. And so we said, okay. I hung up and I went back to my bed. And at this point, that's when I start getting these flashes that start going through my mind. And they're not necessarily in order, but I start having these flashes. In some of the flashes, I'm in some sort of room, but I can't make out the details of the room. There's this yellow haze. At one point, I see my colleague across the room, and he's in his like black briefs with his back turned toward me. And then I have these flashes of different sensations, like a feeling of being bitten on my arm. I have this sensation of being kissed, but I don't, it's weird. Like I don't have a sense of where my body is or what it's doing or what I'm saying, if I'm saying anything. These are just very disconnected flashes. They don't make sense. At one point, there's a flash of him asking me if I'm on birth control, and another one of him asking me to leave several times. And it's weird because I don't remember what I'm saying. I just remember things that he's doing. And then the next thing I know, I'm in some sort of lobby. I'm running around and it feels like I'm in some sort of dream. It doesn't feel real. And then the next thing I know, there's there's people grabbing me. There's a flash of people like grabbing me by the arms, and then I'm being strapped into a gurney and being put into the back of an ambulance. And they actually handcuffed me to the gurney. There's a flash of me pulling on the restraint and going, "Wow, that really hurts. This feels really real." And then when the ambulance starts moving, I see the I can see the road through the windows on the ambulance doors, and I can see it moving away from us. And I thought to myself that, wow, this seems really real. And so I'm having all these flashes as I'm sitting there, and it's overwhelming, and I can't make sense of what's in my head, or is that real? Did any of that happen? What is that? And as I'm sitting there, this security guard walks by, and she says, "Oh, you're feeling better now." And I thought to myself, feeling better from what? And she said, "Well, when you came in here, you were screaming, speaking gibberish, and kicking the EMS guys." Oh, and she also said I was trying to, as she put it, flash my goodies. And this was really shocking to hear. I cannot tell you how shocking that was to hear.
Mhm.
And because I have had too much to drink at many times in my life. I've never flashed anyone. So that was just, whoa, what are you saying to me? But in that moment, I was just full of shame, even though I didn't understand what she was telling me.
Right.
But I just felt, wow, I like, who is that person? Eventually, my husband got there. We hugged, we have a conversation, and he said that he had spoken to uh, one of the editors who was not there that day, but she had spoken to the perp, and he had told her that he had taken me back to his hotel to sober me up. That was what he said. I just kind of clung to that hope that maybe that's all it was. Maybe nothing happened. These flashes in my head were some sort of nightmare, not real. And he's still my coworker and he was just trying to be nice. And, nothing happened. It was one of those moments where your brain and your body knows something is true before you do. And I just, I felt like something happened. And I at one point the doctor came over and he looked at my pupils and he said, "Oh, they're looking more normal now." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Oh, well, they were tiny when you came in." And I said, "What does that mean?" And he said, "Well, it's consistent with heroin use." And I was really taken aback, like, I did heroin last night, and I didn't even know how you do it as a first timer. I'm looking at my arms, trying to figure out, really, I did heroin. I just did not understand what he was saying to me. I don't do drugs like that, and so I was super confused. That's when I started realizing that maybe I was drugged, and that's why I don't remember what happened. And it was so sudden, my memory loss. I don't black out when I drink. That's not happened before, and this just came on so suddenly and lasted for a long time. And so I was talking with my husband about it, and he said, your phone was pinging from that hotel for hours. Something probably happened. And so I wrestled with the decision for a while, but ultimately I decided to report it as a rape. But I kept thinking in the back of my mind, like, this is a really serious accusation. If I find out something that proves nothing happened, I'll take it all back. I'll say I was confused, that I wasn't really sure of myself. In my head, like, I wanted to protect him. I thought that he was a nice guy. I thought, I'm just confused. Maybe nothing happened. I was clinging to this hope that maybe it wasn't true. I agreed to do the rape kit, and I'm ushered off into this exam room where I meet the sane nurse. She was really nice, but she was very direct. So she is asking me questions that I can't answer. And very, very quickly, I just started shutting down. I didn't have coherent answers to her questions. I couldn't really tell her what happened. I was disassociating and I just started crying, and I just couldn't answer. And then she did this amazing thing, which was very irritating in the moment, but she started telling me this very irrelevant story about her son and the time he got a tick on his dick. And I couldn't believe she was telling me this story. Why are you telling me this story? I don't care about it. And then I said something shortly after that was a detail that I hadn't remembered. I had shared the flash with her of seeing him across the room in his black briefs. And she said, "Ah, you didn't remember that before." And I thought it was a trick. But then I realized that her story that she'd shared with me was meant to distract me and get me to calm down. And it worked. And I was able to remember more and keep talking. So she examines my body, and she pointed out some bruises on my arms. I had one on my wrist area and then one on my right upper arm. And she's pointing out the one on my upper arm, and she said, "What's that?" And I tried to take a closer look because it was hard to see from my point of view. She says, "Don't touch it." But at that point, I'd already grabbed it. So she just kind of sighed at me and then took a picture and swabbed it. So we went through that process. And then she was the one that pointed out that it didn't make any sense that he would have taken his colleague back to his hotel to sober me up in Brooklyn when at the time I lived in Westchester. And she said that doesn't make any sense that he would take a junior married colleague to his hotel when you live in the opposite direction and you have a husband and he could have just put you in a cab and sent you home. And that was when it dawned on me that she's right. Something did happen. This is not the story. She said he's probably done this before, that you don't wake up in your 40s and just start drugging and raping colleagues, that he's probably done this before. And that was really the moment when I decided I have to keep going with this. I have to report this, even if it just made me feel sick to my stomach. And so she brought out the forms and I just stared at that signature line. But after she told me that this could stop him from doing this to somebody else, that's what made me sign because I thought, I need to do this. I need to do this. If this stops him from hurting somebody else, then that will make it worth it. So after that, some police officers came into the room and started asking me questions. It was very jarring because the officer who was asking me questions he was just reading from a form. He was barely looking at me, just reading from a form, saying things like, "Can you describe what he looked like?" And I couldn't for the life of me put into words what his face looked like. And I finally said, "Oh, go look on LinkedIn." Like, I'm not good at describing faces. Just go look on LinkedIn. And they'd ask me, what was he wearing? It was one of those things where I didn't know to remember every single thing he was wearing. And I think I made a sharp little joke like he wasn't wearing hot pink. He was wearing a work shirt. I don't know. It was nothing that really stood out or what registered in my brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was one irritating question after another. And then finally, when they were leaving, there was something about the way they were leaving that made me think, oh, because they were going to the hotel and they were confirming what he looked like and what he was wearing. And I thought for some reason that they were going to go arrest him. The nurse even said to me, like, you want him arrested, right? And I was really taken aback because at that point I still wasn't sure what had happened. And so I very hesitantly said yes. And then they disappeared. Turns out I needn't have been so worried because they did not leave to go arrest him. Have no idea what they went to go do, but it wasn't to arrest him. And then I'm told that a special victims detective will come by to the hospital to interview me. The nurse asked me if I wanted shots to prevent STDs, and I didn't know what had happened, so I said yes. And I did not realize those are very painful shots. Like, it kind of goes deep into your bicep, like goes into the muscle. It's very painful. I remember getting the shot, and I have a pretty high pain tolerance, but that was pretty brutal. And I was still in pain when the detective arrived. The detective took, well, we tried to find a secluded area, but there really wasn't a secluded room in that part of the hospital. So we ended up sitting in kind of this open area with a curtain. I kept having to pause every time someone walked by because I didn't want anyone to hear what we were talking about. The thing that stood out was one of the very first questions he asked me was, is this really a case of assault or is it a case of regret? And I I don't even remember what I said. I just started babbling and I rambled this kind of defensive answer, but I had to say I wasn't really sure what happened, but I wanted to find out. I believe something happened. This is not just regret. I have this long gap in my memory. Something is not right. And I want to find the truth. But it just really put us off in a bad, started us off on a bad foot,
Right.
because
Sure.
that was what he asked me first.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do the interview, and he says to me at the end that, there's really not much to go on because I don't remember. And so he wants to do what's called a controlled call to the perpetrator. So he explains what that is. I'm going to make a tape recorded phone call to the perpetrator and I'm going to try to get a confession out of him. And this is terrifying to me. I'm going to confront this guy. I don't even know what happened. How do I speak to him about something like this? It instantly just makes me feel sick to my stomach. But he says to me, this is the only way to keep going with the case. And so I took that at face value. I didn't know any better. So I said, okay. We agreed to have me come by the next day to the precinct to do that call. He wanted to do it the same day, but by that point, it was really late in the day. This is the day after the assault. I had been at the hospital all day long and I was exhausted. And so I went home. My husband went to the daycare to go get our son, and I just went directly home. I remember when I walked into my bathroom and finally looked at myself, I just looked a mess. Like my eyelids were purple because at one point I'd thrown up in the hospital and my hair was crazy. And but the thing that stood out is it looked like, because I had been wearing makeup the previous day, and it looked like somebody had wiped my face clean, except for my eye makeup, which was kind of like smeared. But otherwise, my face had been wiped clean. I never did figure out why my face was clean or who cleaned it, but that detail stuck out to me. Later that night, I finally fell asleep and I had this nightmare that my colleague's face was right in front of me, just kind of bodiless, just ahead. He was saying my name while I was kind of fading backward as if I was going through a tunnel. And he's just saying, Leslie. And there's this pressure on my chest, like something is holding me down. And I startled awake and I was drenched in sweat. And at that point, I realized that what was holding me down was just my husband's arm, just kind of draped over me. That was my first of many nightmares, the same nightmare. And that's when I first realized I'm going to have problems sleeping. This is going to be something that makes it hard to sleep. So the next day, I go to the special victims office to do the controlled call. We started setting up right away for the call, and I realized he was ready to go. I said, wait a minute, what do I say? And he said something like, oh, just buddy up to him, tell him you had a great time and you just can't remember everything. And could he fill in the blanks? And then just try to get as much information out of him as you can. This was the length of my prep for the call. It was just like that, very quick. And I said, can I have a notepad? Because I wanted to write down some talking points or questions to ask. And he looked amused and he said, a notepad, like I'd asked for strawberry ice cream. And so he gets me the notepad, and I don't even remember what I wrote down because I didn't keep the paper, but I wrote down some questions and talking points. And he said, you know, you're the second most nervous person I've ever seen do this. That comment struck me very funny because I thought, what a weirdly specific thing to say. I'm not even the most nervous person. I'm the second most nervous. But of course, I didn't have the wherewithal to be in that moment to be like, how dare you say that to me? I was still like, my mind was a mess. And I didn't react. So we set up to do the call and I call, but it goes to voicemail. So I leave this 10-second friendly sounding voicemail following the script that the detective gave me and hang up. And then I start panicking, like, what if this guy doesn't call me back? And he calls back. When we start off the call, he immediately wants to meet in person, but I managed to, the detective was kind of shaking his head. I managed to deflect that by saying, oh, I can't really do that. I have family coming into town, which was true. They were coming into town for my son's birthday. And so I kept the conversation going. But at first, he didn't want to talk. And he said that he felt uncomfortable. I said, well, can you tell me the name of the third bar? And I just wanted him to like keep going. So he confirmed the name of the third bar. And then that seemed to kind of warm him up. And he just started talking. And he said that we were at the third bar. And he said that I came onto him, that I suddenly lunged across the table and started making out with him. And at this point, hearing that, I'm just flooded with shame. And I let him say it. I didn't question it. And I said, and then what happened? And he said, well, we paid the bill, and then we left the bar and headed back to my hotel. And at this point, I see where the conversation's going, and I'm just full of dread. And I said, and then what happened? And he said, and then we went up to my hotel room, and then we had sex. And at that point, the room just spun. I It was like in the movies where you hear that tinnitus, high pitched ringing. That's what happened to me. I just wanted to be off that call at that point. Everything that I had feared was true, and I just didn't want to be on the call anymore. I wanted to hang up so badly. But I remembered what the detective said. I wanted to get as much information as I could. And so somehow I just kept asking questions and we kept going. And he said that I started to get really weird and I wouldn't leave. He kept telling me to leave and I wouldn't leave. I wouldn't answer my phone, even though my husband kept calling. He said it took an hour and a half to get me dressed. I wish that I had pounced on that when he said it, because how is that possible? Why would it take an adult that long to get dressed? It didn't make any sense. And then he said he left me with a security guard downstairs and I started flirting with the guy and trying to flash people. And again, I'm just hearing this, I'm just kind of shriveling up into myself. I'm just so ashamed, and it was really hard to hear all this. It was like hearing about another person. I just didn't recognize myself at all hearing this. He said that he had to tell his wife because she was coming into town to meet him that day, which was a detail I had completely forgotten about. She was coming into New York to spend some time with him in New York. This is one of those moments that haunts me, but it made sense in the flow of the conversation that I apologized to him, that he had to tell his wife what happened. And I can't believe I did that, but I did. I apologized to him. So now I know that his wife knows and he's kind of, in trouble with her. So on top of everything, I'm feeling guilt for that. Then he said that he also had told our boss, I'll call Blake, that's not his name, but he told our boss, Blake, about what happened. And now I'm cheeks burning. I'm just freaked out that my boss knows. So now I'm worried that I'm in trouble. And he said, just don't worry. I took care of all that. You don't have to say anything. It wasn't until much, much later that I realized by telling me his wife knows, the boss knows, it was a way to silence me. So I
Mhm.
wouldn't say anything to anybody. He's already gotten out and ahead of the story. And now there's no point in me saying anything. So we end the call and I am just distraught. I am sitting there and I'm sobbing, and I don't even know how long I sat there just sobbing. And the detective is just sitting there looking at me. And he said, that phone call really hurt you. He had all the right answers. And then he pulls out this form and he says that this form will put the case on hold pending further evidence. And I would love to tell you that I read the form and that I questioned it, but I did not. I was just, get me out of here. I don't want to be here.
Yeah.
And so I signed it. I did not read the form at all. I just signed it, trusting him with what he was saying. And it's not like he presented it like a choice. It was just there. And so I signed it. I didn't get a copy of it. I just left. To I just wanted to be out of that situation. So I went home. I then made some phone calls and told a few people about what happened, including my parents. My parents were there. I want to say they were there the next day. They were coming into town for my son's birthday party, which was supposed to be that weekend. They came into town, and my dad is a retired attorney. He used to be a defense lawyer. And so my dad tells me that I should write everything down that I can remember, because even though you think you're going to remember it forever, you don't always.
Right.
I didn't want to postpone or cancel my son's party because then I would know that I canceled it for my rapist. And it meant a lot to me to still have the party. I don't know how I did that party. And if you looked at pictures of me at the time, you would think, oh, she was totally fine. There's pictures of me smiling and talking to people, but I was just, I was not there. I was going through the motions. I was talking, I was smiling, but I wasn't there. I don't know how I got through that, to be honest. Because all I could think about was what the detective had said, which is, that phone call really hurt you. He had all the right answers. And so I was really clinging to the hope that when the blood and urine tests that they did to see what, maybe was in my system, I was clinging to the hope that that would vindicate me, that would show that there was something in my system. My case was worthy of investigation and prosecution. So in my head, there was that chance. It was a small chance, but there was a chance. And so when I went home and my parents came into town and they, had told me to write everything down, I did that. It took a while because my memories were so jumbled and didn't really make sense. And I had to, look at my phone to see when I had been texting with my husband and what times he called me. And so I did that. I made a timeline of everything that I remembered plus what was available on my phone and what Brian remembered. So I made like a pretty good timeline to the best of my ability. I'm really glad that I did that. I'll say more about that later. So I did that, somehow managed the party for my son. And then after that weekend, and everybody went home from the party, my parents left, my in laws left. The next week, I was supposed to be at work and I was a mess. And I requested to work from home. And I spoke to HR the following week and reported what had happened. And in my head, I thought, okay, I'm reporting it. He's done. That's the end of that. And I'll be safe at work. I won't have to deal with this person anymore. And I was put on administrative leave. The two of us were, which I didn't know would happen. And I'll say it felt punitive. I was super embarrassed because I thought, well, if people see that both of us go on leave at the same time, they're going to assume something possibly sexual happened because, like, what else would it be? That made me feel ashamed because I just didn't like the thought of people thinking of me like that. But there was nothing I could really do about it. But I was trusting the process. I thought, okay, they'll do an investigation, they'll see that I'm not lying, and he'll be gone. So while that was going on, I was going to therapy and I also was trying to get records from the hospital. I tried to get the police report and the ambulance records. There is a lot of bureaucratic red tape. It's not so easy to just go and get records. I had to find out what EMS it was, what ambulance it was. I had to go to the hospital in person to go get the records. And to my surprise, when I went to go get the records, I didn't see that comment that I remembered about my pinpoint pupils. It just wasn't there. But there were some other comments that suggested that I had been drugged because there was a line about me acting out in the lobby of a hotel and acting erratically. So there were like a few indications like something was really, really wrong with me. But it was a struggle to get all of those records. Also, during this period, I had been emailing the detective. I sent him 3 different emails as I remembered things and as I thought about questions to ask him. You should look into this, or this thing this guy said to me like doesn't make sense. You should ask him. I sent him 3 different emails. No response. Never responded to me. I also called him a bunch of times, and it got to be kind of funny because every time I called the precinct, I had just missed him. He was on another call. He's on vacation, just left for the day. I mean, I just could never get him. I had told my dad what was going on, that I was struggling to reach him. And so my dad also called him a bunch of times. And at one point, the detective called me because he got really annoyed that my dad was calling him. And he told me that my dad shouldn't be calling. He's only going to talk to me. He's not going to talk to my dad. And then he kind of softens up and asks how I'm doing. I asked him, had he spoken to the witnesses yet, like my other colleagues? the other colleague that was there, Stephen. And he said, no, but he will. He never did. He never talked to any witnesses. On a separate conversation with him, I asked him if he'd ever talked to the perpetrator. And he said, no, but we already had the controlled phone call. So why does he need to talk to him? And I said, I don't know. Maybe he would say something different. I mean, it was just
Wow.
like so incredible. Like, I mean, I'm not a detective, but I don't know. Maybe people will say something different when they know they're talking to the cops.
It
Just
is
a thought.
incredible. It's mind-boggling that he wouldn't have talked to the perpetrator.
He never talked to the perpetrator or Stephen or the other person that the perpetrator talked to, that editor that I mentioned. Never talked to her either. Never talked to anybody. Just me and my husband when we were at the hospital. That was it. So the only detective work was actually my detective work making the controlled call. That was all the evidence.
Wow.
During this period, I wasn't sure when, if ever, my kit was going to be tested. I did some Googling and figured out where the state lab was, and I contacted them directly. And I explained who I was and that I really wanted to get a copy of the results. Now, I don't know if they would have just tested the kit soon enough anyway, but next thing I know, the results were in. So I showed up in person and I got the results. I went to a restaurant. I had a friend with me. We sat there and we just poured over the results. Like my heart was pounding. I thought, okay, this is it. I'm going to find out what it was. And it was like one sheet of paper. I couldn't believe the list of drugs was so short that they tested for. And I just saw not detected, not detected, not detected. And I'm just staring at it. I just couldn't understand. The only thing they found was ethanol, alcohol,
Mm-hmm.
and it was at a level of almost legally intoxicated when they tested me. So they tested me, it was almost 8 a.m. and I had gotten to the hospital around 1:51 a.m. And so I was almost legally intoxicated somehow still. That was the only thing they found other than a drug called a Dancitron. It was like a anti-nausea medication, which was not a surprise because I had vomited in the hospital. So I figured that's what that was because they did give me something for nausea. So my heart just sank. And the only other thing that was on there, which didn't really make any sense to me, was acetone. They detected acetone. And at that time, I thought, nail polish remover? Why did they detect that? I was really confused and disheartened by the results. And I couldn't believe it wasn't some giant list of drugs. It was just a short list. And so I thought, that's it? That can't be it. And I also didn't have the rest of the results if they found semen or anything like that. So I didn't have that. I want to say it was a few days later, the detective calls, and I think that he heard that I went to go get the results myself because then he was like, I have it right here. So he proceeds to tell me what I already knew. I said, do you have the other results from the kit? And he said, oh, yeah, it's right here. As if, I don't know, as if he just happened to have it at the top of a stack or something. He didn't really explain it to me. He just kind of read me a bunch of jargon that just went right over my head. All I heard was semen, positive, bunch of keywords like that. And I just, once again, it just felt so sick. Not that it was a surprise to me, but it was still just made me feel really gross. And it was hard to hear that.
Sure.
But I thought, okay, this is good because that proves that it was rape, that I was raped. And he said, well, but it doesn't really prove that because we already knew there was sex. He already said it was consensual. And my heart just sank. So I went through that for nothing. It doesn't prove anything because he said it was consensual. Like, of course he's going to say that.
Right.
What a great cover. That conversation did not go well, and it became clear to me that he was about to close the case. He did tell me that if I wanted to, I could have my samples transferred to a private lab if I wanted to do further testing. And I decided I did want to do that. I wanted to know what I had been drugged with. He just gave me that information. He was not helping me with that process.
Right.
So I had to do some digging and figure out. I did find a private lab, which was pretty well known. It's called NMS Labs. I contacted them and learned about the process. And it turns out it is another nightmarish bureaucratic process. They need a chain of custody, which makes sense for the sample, but they will not deal with you directly. So I had to have a doctor or a lawyer order the test. They would not deal with me directly. And I didn't have either at the time. I didn't have anybody who really knew about any of this, who could order this test, who would liaise with the lab. I had to tell the state lab how much of the sample I needed exactly. They needed the test code. They needed the address of the lab. It had to be certified. All these things. I had this laundry list of things that I had to make sure. I had to send a certified letter, all of these things. It was a process, but I was determined. I was going to find out what I was drugged with. So I actually went through this crazy process. I had to hire a lawyer to get them to be the liaison with the lab. And they also helped me get my complete records from the hospital. I was really grateful to them. They helped me a lot. I was able to get my complete records from the hospital, and that record had the comment about my pinpoint pupils because that had the triage notes on it. The person who triaged me, the doctor, he noted my pinpoint pupils. And that document also said that when I came in, I was speaking gibberish. So that backed up the things that I had been hearing about how I was acting. So I was so grateful to have that record. And I thought, woo, this is like a smoking gun. This
Yeah.
list shows that it was not just alcohol alone, it was proof that I was speaking gibberish, but that ended up not being enough. I did 2 rounds of testing on the urine sample from the hospital, and it was a really robust set of testing that they did for all sorts of compounds, but they didn't find anything. By the time they had taken that particular sample that was from the rape kit, not the original test that they did when I was in the ER, it was 12 something when they took that sample. So by that time, I had been in the hospital for over 11 hours. So this is like a pretty long time that had passed. And so what I learned is unfortunately most drugs will metabolize out of your body really fast. And so the chances of finding anything were slim. So after I did 2 rounds of testing, I just gave up. I thought, that's it. I did my best. I give up. And in the meantime, at work, the quote unquote investigation had ended, and I found out they were not going to let him go, that without an arrest, there wasn't much they could do. That's what they told me. And they said they told him that he needed to be professional.
Wow.
Yeah, they told him that he had to be professional, as if that ship hadn't already sailed.
There you go. That'll fix it.
That'll fix it. And I was just shocked. I did not think that would happen. I thought with such a graphic and detailed story, surely that was it. But that was not it. They told him to be professional. And I was so shocked and angry. I just couldn't believe how circular this all was. They wouldn't do anything because he wasn't being arrested, and he wasn't being arrested because the detective didn't do an investigation. So it was all just this big, giant circle of injustice. I didn't know what to do, but I had to go back to work. I went back to work, and the only thing I could think to do was refuse to be in meetings with him, because he didn't work in my office, but I had to refuse to be in any virtual meetings with him. As you might imagine, that excluded me from a lot of meetings. And so I was very isolated. I couldn't really talk to anyone about this. I couldn't go to meetings. Nobody really knew what was going on, and I didn't know what people knew, so I didn't tell anybody. And I was in that cycle of therapy, going to work for about a year. And one day I was on my way to work, and at some point, must have signed up for a newsletter from the National Organization for Women New York City chapter. The newsletter was profiling this advocate. Her name is Jane Manning, and she supports survivors, and knew a lot about drug facilitated sexual assaults, and was talking about that in the newsletter. And I was just really overwhelmed reading that. I thought, wow, this person is just such a warrior. She sounds amazing. And so, without a thought, I just shot off an email to her, and I was just thanking her for what she was doing. And all I said was, I'm a DFSA survivor, and the work you're doing is super important. And thank you. I didn't think anything of it. I didn't expect a response. I just sent it. And she wrote me back. She wanted to talk about my experience. I was kind of surprised by that. And I thought, okay. And so we had a conversation, a long one as it turned out. She did have questions, but she asked me questions in a way that just made me think about my experience in a brand new way. Her questions were so good. What I learned and what I had not realized when I wrote to her was that she was a former sex crimes prosecutor. Honestly, I think if I had read that, I would have been too chicken to write to her. So I'm really glad I didn't read that before I emailed her. She was just so lovely. She said, I can't promise anything, but there is a chance if I speak with the chief of the Special Victims Division that maybe we could get your case reopened. She said that there should have been a lot of evidence here from surveillance tapes at the hotel, receipts from the bar. There was an eyewitness for most of the night. There's a lot here. And I woke up in the hospital. This is not like days later I realized something happened and then I went to the hospital. I was actually in the hospital, which is rare.
Yeah.
So I was really surprised when she said that. At first, I thought, am I really going to do all of this again after such a horrendous experience?
Right.
But I thought maybe this is finally my chance to get justice. And so I said yes. And then a little while later, I get this call from a blocked number, which is always the police. I learned.
Yeah.
So I let it go to voicemail because I'm not sure who's calling. And it turns out it's a new detective. And he calls me and he said that he just left my apartment in Westchester. At that point, we had moved and we're in Long Island. And he said, they just left my apartment in Westchester. He was hoping to come by and speak with me. At first, that was very jarring because I thought, oh my God, they were just going to show up to talk to me. But I ended up calling him back and we set a time for him and his partner to come to my house. So they actually came to my house, sat down at my dining table. It was kind of funny because Detective Santos, that's his name. He's a big guy, and so he's there, and his partner is on the other side. We're in this like small dining nook because it's a New York apartment. We're just kind of jammed in there doing this interview. But what I loved about the way that he interviewed me is it was trauma informed. He just kind of let me talk. It was so unlike the first time I had been questioned or the second time I had been questioned by the police officer in the hospital, where it was like right off a form, just,
Right.
what does he look like? And, things like that.
Checkbox. Yeah.
Yeah, checkbox. They just let me talk. When they asked me questions, it was done in a way that really made me think and helped me remember things that I had just forgotten.
Right. It's interviewed in a trauma informed way. If it sparks those other thought processes, that's a good trauma informed interview. That's what it's supposed to do. That's what they're designed to do.
Yeah. And it was just night and day how they interviewed me. It was really great. And then at the end of the conversation, I told him that I had notes from that time. And he said, if we take the notes, it'll be considered evidence. Did you mean for the notes to be evidence? And I thought about it. I said, you can have them. And so I ended up giving him the notes and he left me with his card. And I asked what's going to happen next. And he said they're going to interview my colleagues about what they remembered, including my boss. And I was terrified. I thought, oh my gosh, what are people going to say about me? I don't know. I don't know what they know. But I was hoping that they would be on my side. Even though I never really talked to them about it, they would be on my side. The only person that really knew anything was a person at work who I considered a friend. She had texted me shortly after it happened saying she was hearing things at work and could I tell her what was going on. So I ended up calling her and giving her just the highlights of what I knew at that point, which wasn't much. But other than that, I didn't really talk to anybody. I wasn't really sure what people would say and I was really nervous, but he told me like, don't warn anybody, don't tell anybody, because then they can prepare their answers. So just, say nothing, just let it happen. So it was a very tense period because I had to act like I didn't know anything.
Sure.
And so that was really nerve wracking. They also went to go interview my friend Melanie in Florida because I had called her shortly after the assault to tell her what happened. And I barely remembered this conversation because everything was just a haze. I called several people to tell them what happened, including her. I didn't remember what I told to which person. It was a blur.
Sure.
They said that she was what's called an outcry witness, meaning she was somebody that I reached out to and told her what happened.
Correct.
And so she could help corroborate my story.
Mm-hmm.
And so they were going to do that. My mom, meanwhile, had been insisting that she be interviewed because she also saw me in person shortly after the assault and saw what my demeanor was like. So she felt that was important for them. But at the time, I was too embarrassed to say, hey, interview my mom. So I didn't bring it up with Santos for a little while. But eventually, I did tell him, hey, she saw me a few days after, and I did tell her what happened. And she saw me in a pretty bad PTSD state. She had gone grocery shopping with me, and I just kept doing this thing where I would just kind of stand there in a daze in the middle of the aisle, and she would ask me questions, and it was like hearing a question underwater. It's like I couldn't focus on what she was saying.
Right.
I don't know how I went shopping. It was like very bizarre. I was very out of it. And she thought that was important for them to hear because it showed that I'm not lying. I really had a bad PTSD after this happened.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, I brought it up to him and he said, yeah, we would like to interview her. So they actually were flying around the country interviewing people. And I was really shocked that this is how it worked. And I actually felt bad because I thought, wow, that's a lot of department resources for me. But I was glad that they were taking it seriously and they were interviewing. It just didn't go well for the most part.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. Recording these deeply personal and often painful stories of deception and trauma is never easy. But week after week, survivors courageously share their experiences with us, advancing their own healing while educating and empowering us all. Leslie's strength and vulnerability represent the heart of the SASS community, and I'm truly grateful to her for sharing her story with us. Be sure to join us next week for the powerful conclusion of Leslie's journey, as she bravely tackles the systemic issues and biases she encountered within the New York Police Department's Special Victims Division. I want to encourage all of you to be a part of bringing justice to survivors. One of the most impactful ways to support victims and survivors is to start by believing. Whenever you encounter someone sharing their story, offering your support to those who reach out can make all the difference, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. By believing and standing with survivors, we help create a community of trust and healing. And it's time we start normalizing these conversations and work together to dismantle the rape culture in our society. If you've found this episode meaningful, please take a moment to leave a 5-star rating on this podcast platform. Also, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email with your thoughts or words of encouragement. Your messages help fuel my passion to keep this podcast going, and I truly appreciate hearing from you. My email address is in the episode notes. Thank you again for being here. Don't miss next Tuesday's episode, where we'll hear part 2 of Leslie's incredible story right here on Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SASS podcast. We'll see you next week.